The sand burned like fire against his skin, hot brass casings raining down as deafening gunfire erupted all around him. Lieutenant William Richards crouched low in the shadow of the landing craft's steel ramp, the taste of salt and bile bitter in his mouth as he surveyed the hellscape of Omaha Beach. Bullets pinged against the hull of his vessel, a simple wooden boat with a drop-down front gate that had just delivered 36 terrified young Americans into the maw of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The date was June 6, 1944. The place? Normandy, France. And as Richards signaled the coxswain to reverse engines and pull back into the churning English Channel, he had no idea that this unglamorous plywood craft, despised by the Navy brass but adored by the Marines, would later be credited with winning the entire war. Across the blood-soaked shoreline, 2,000 more of these humble vessels, officially designated landing craft, vehicle, personnel, but known universally as Higgins boats, were delivering the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. Not a single general had thought such an operation possible just 4 years earlier. Back home in America, in a sprawling New Orleans factory complex, a hard-drinking, profane businessman named Andrew Jackson Higgins was tracking reports of the invasion. Knowing his unorthodox manufacturing methods and defiance of naval tradition had made this moment possible. The Navy's official landing craft designs had proven useless in real-world conditions. Higgins, with no formal engineering education and a profound disdain for military bureaucracy, had created the solution using boat-building techniques honed in the Louisiana bayous. What few people along that Normandy shoreline knew was that the vessel delivering them had been designed by a man who had never served a day in military uniform, had been ridiculed by the naval establishment, and had created his revolutionary craft by modifying a bootlegger's boat from the Prohibition era. No one in the 21st Armored Division knew that one man's defiance of naval orthodoxy that morning would rewrite battlefield history and be described by General Eisenhower years later as the vessel that won the war. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born on August 28, 1886, in Columbus, Nebraska, far from any ocean. The son of John Gauneagle Higgins and Annie Long O'Connor Higgins, young Andrew was the youngest of their children, growing up in America's heartland, where the only waters were rivers and small lakes. His father owned a local store, providing a modest but stable living for the family. From an early age, Higgins showed little interest in formal schooling, much to his parents' dismay. Instead, he displayed an uncanny, mechanical aptitude that bordered on genius, often dismantling household items to understand their inner workings. While other children in Columbus played conventional games, young Higgins spent hours crafting makeshift boats to sail on nearby ponds and streams. With scraps of wood and discarded materials, he experimented with different hull shapes and designs, testing how they performed in varying water conditions. His parents, recognizing their son's unusual talents despite his academic disinterest, reluctantly supported his mechanical pursuits, hoping they might lead to a practical trade. By his teenage years, Higgins had designed and built a racing boat that easily outpaced all others on the local lake, displaying an early talent for maximizing a vessel's speed-to-power ratio, a skill that would later prove crucial to military operations. Local residents were astounded by how the homemade craft, built by a teenager with limited resources, could outperform boats constructed by experienced adults. This early success fed Higgins's growing confidence in his ability to solve practical engineering problems through intuition and experimentation, rather than formal education. The conventional path for a young man in Nebraska at the turn of the 20th century would have been to settle into farming or take over the family business. But Higgins harbored larger ambitions. At 17, restless and hungry for experience beyond the confines of small-town life, he left Nebraska to seek his fortune. His departure was abrupt, with only a hastily packed bag and a few dollars in his pocket. His mother, sensing her youngest son's determinative nature, simply told him, "Write when you can." It would be years before he returned to Columbus, and by then he would be a changed man. His first stop was the timber country of Alabama, where he found work in the lumber industry. The punishing physical labor might have broken a less determined young man, but Higgins thrived in this environment. He absorbed everything about wood, how different species responded to water, how grain patterns affected strength, how cutting techniques could preserve or destroy a board's natural properties. This intimate knowledge of lumber would later prove invaluable when designing vessels meant to withstand the punishing conditions of combat landings. After mastering the basics of lumbering, Higgins sought new challenges. He briefly tried his hand as a professional boxer, stepping into rings across the South. Though not a natural pugilist, he compensated with sheer tenacity, refusing to stay down regardless of the punishment he absorbed. This fighting spirit earned him a reputation as a man who couldn't be intimidated, a quality that would serve him well in future business negotiations with military bureaucrats. More importantly, boxing taught him to analyze opponents, identify weaknesses, and adapt his approach accordingly. Strategic thinking that would later define his approach to boat design. Higgins drifted through various jobs throughout his 20s, working as a logger, a timber buyer, even briefly managing a small sawmill. He was building a diverse practical education that no formal institution could have provided. By his late 20s, having accumulated both experience and a modest sum of money, Higgins made the decision that would shape the remainder of his life. He moved to New Orleans, Louisiana. The Crescent City, with its strategic location at the mouth of the Mississippi River and its centuries-old maritime tradition, would provide the perfect environment for Higgins' ambitions to flourish. New Orleans in the 1920s was a city of stark contrasts. Elegant French quarter mansions stood just blocks from poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Sophisticated Creole society coexisted with rough dock workers and sailors. For Higgins, the city offered something more valuable than its social contradictions: access to the Mississippi River Delta, with its intricate network of bayous, swamps, and shallow waterways. This challenging environment demanded specialized watercraft that could navigate where conventional boats would founder. The timing of Higgins's arrival in New Orleans was fortuitous. America was entering the Prohibition era, and the Gulf Coast was becoming a prime corridor for smuggling liquor from Caribbean islands and Central America. While Higgins himself never engaged directly in bootlegging, he quickly recognized the market for specialized boats that could outrun Coast Guard vessels and navigate the shallow, debris-filled waterways of the Louisiana bayous. Using his knowledge of wood properties and boat design, he began crafting vessels specifically tailored to these challenging conditions. In 1922, with savings from his various jobs, Higgins established Higgins Lumber and Export Company. The business initially focused on importing hardwood from Central America and the Caribbean for resale to American furniture manufacturers. However, to support this operation, Higgins needed specialized boats capable of navigating both open seas and the shallow waters of tropical river deltas. Finding no suitable craft on the market, he designed his own, the first of many times when his solution to a practical problem would lead to innovation. The boats Higgins designed for his lumber operation featured several distinctive characteristics: shallow drafts that allowed them to operate in minimal water depth, protected propellers that wouldn't be damaged by submerged obstacles, and sturdy construction that could withstand the rigors of commercial use. Word of these unusual vessels spread quickly along the Gulf Coast, and soon Higgins was receiving inquiries from oil companies, fishermen, and other businesses facing similar nautical challenges. Recognizing the potential of this unexpected demand, Higgins gradually shifted his business focus. By 1926, he had established Higgins Industries, dedicated primarily to boat building. The company began with a small team, just 75 employees working in a modest facility. Higgins personally oversaw every aspect of the operation, from design to construction to testing. Unlike traditional naval architects, who worked primarily from mathematical formulas and theoretical models, Higgins designed through a process of practical experimentation, personally testing prototypes in the challenging conditions of Louisiana waterways. The most significant early design to emerge from this process was the Eureka boat, a shallow draft vessel with several revolutionary features. The Eureka had a protected propeller recessed in a semi-tunnel at the rear of the hull, allowing it to operate in water filled with vegetation and debris without fouling. Its bow featured a distinctive spoonbill design that allowed the boat to be driven directly onto a riverbank or shoreline and then easily reversed back into the water without damage. Most importantly, it could operate effectively in as little as 18 inches of water while carrying substantial cargo. The Eureka quickly became popular with oil exploration companies operating in the coastal marshes of Louisiana and Texas. These companies needed to transport equipment and personnel to remote drilling sites inaccessible by conventional boats or land vehicles. The Eureka's ability to navigate shallow waters and beach itself for loading and unloading made it ideally suited to these operations. Similar appeal attracted commercial fishermen, trappers, and wildlife managers who worked in the region's extensive wetlands. Less officially, the Eureka also gained popularity with another group, rum runners and bootleggers smuggling alcohol during Prohibition. The boat's speed, maneuverability, and ability to operate in shallow waters where larger Coast Guard vessels couldn't follow made it ideal for illicit operations along the Gulf Coast. While Higgins himself maintained legal business operations, he was certainly aware of how some customers were using his boats. This association did nothing to endear him to government authorities, creating friction that would later complicate his relationship with the naval establishment. Throughout the 1920s and early 30s, Higgins continued refining the Eureka design based on customer feedback and his own observations. Each iteration incorporated practical improvements, more efficient hull shapes for greater speed, strengthened construction for durability, enhanced steering systems for better maneuverability. These changes weren't driven by theoretical engineering principles, but by real-world performance requirements, an approach that stood in stark contrast to the naval establishment's design philosophy. While Higgins was developing his boat-building business in New Orleans, events halfway around the world were creating conditions that would eventually transform his company. In the 1930s, Japan began a series of aggressive military expansions in Asia, including the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and full-scale war with China in 1937. These operations included numerous amphibious landings along the Chinese coast, using specialized landing craft developed by the Japanese Navy. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., American military planners were belatedly recognizing the strategic challenges posed by potential conflict in the Pacific. The vast distances between islands meant that any campaign against Japan would require numerous amphibious operations, landing troops directly onto hostile shores rather than at established ports. This realization prompted the U.S. Marine Corps to begin developing doctrine and equipment for amphibious warfare, an area that had received little attention since World War I. The problem facing Marine planners was daunting. Traditional naval ships couldn't approach close to shore without risking grounding, forcing troops to transfer to small boats for the final approach. These conventional boats, however, had no means of deploying troops directly onto beaches. Soldiers had to jump over the sides into often chest-deep water, then wade ashore carrying heavy equipment while exposed to enemy fire. The casualties and inefficiency of this approach were obvious, but the Navy's Bureau of Ships had made little progress developing alternatives. The solution would come from an unexpected source. In 1937, a Marine Corps officer named Victor Krulak was serving as an observer with American forces in Shanghai during the Japanese invasion of China. Krulak witnessed Japanese troops using specialized landing craft with bow ramps that allowed soldiers to disembark directly onto beaches without wading through water. Recognizing the significance of this innovation, he documented these observations in a detailed report, complete with photographs and sketches. Upon his return to the United States, Krulak submitted his findings to the Navy's Bureau of Ships, expecting serious interest in this potential solution to the amphibious landing problem. Instead, the Bureau largely dismissed his report, continuing to focus on their own internally developed designs, despite their obvious shortcomings. This institutional resistance to external ideas, particularly those adapted from potential enemies, typified the naval establishment's approach to innovation at the time. The Marine Corps, however, maintained interest in finding effective landing craft. In 1938, Marine officers attending a boat exhibition in New Orleans noticed Higgins's Eureka boat, though lacking a bow ramp like the Japanese craft Krulak had observed. The Eureka's ability to operate in shallow water and beach itself without damage immediately suggested its potential for amphibious operations. The Marines arranged a demonstration, inviting Higgins to showcase his boat against the Navy's current designs. The competition, held on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans, produced dramatic results. Higgins' Eureka boat outperformed the Navy's designs in every relevant category: speed, maneuverability, beaching ability, and extraction from shore. Most importantly, it could operate effectively in much shallower water than any Navy vessel, allowing troops to be delivered much closer to beaches. The Marines were impressed, but the Navy remained resistant, unwilling to abandon their internally developed designs in favor of a civilian alternative. Higgins, for his part, was initially uninterested in military contracts. His civilian business was thriving, and he had little patience for government bureaucracy. However, the prospect of designing boats that might someday save American lives in combat appealed to his patriotic instincts. When approached by Marine officers about adapting his Eureka boat for military use, he agreed to work with them, beginning a collaboration that would ultimately reshape modern warfare. This collaboration remained contentious with the Navy throughout the pre-war period. Navy officials continued to favor their own designs despite repeated test failures, while Higgins continued to refine his craft based on direct feedback from Marine Corps operators. The tension reached a critical point when Major Krulak shared with Higgins his observations of the Japanese landing craft with their bow ramps. This feature, allowing troops to disembark directly onto beaches without getting wet, was the one significant advantage Japanese craft held over the Eureka. Higgins immediately recognized the value of this innovation. With characteristic decisiveness, he returned to his workshop and began designing a modified version of the Eureka, incorporating a bow ramp. Working primarily from Krulak's descriptions and rough sketches, without any direct examination of the Japanese vessels, Higgins and his team developed a functional prototype in less than a month, an astonishing feat of engineering improvisation. The first tests of this ramped Eureka showed promise, but revealed technical challenges. The ramp mechanism needed to be strong enough to support heavy equipment, yet light enough not to compromise the boat's performance. It needed to seal tightly when closed to prevent water ingress during navigation, yet deploy reliably under combat conditions. Through iterative testing and refinement, Higgins's team solved these problems one by one, drawing on their experience with practical, field-tested solutions rather than theoretical engineering approaches. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, creating immediate and urgent demand for military equipment of all kinds, including landing craft. The very next day, December 8th, Higgins filed his patent application for the ramped landing craft, a timing that reflected his recognition of the boat's sudden strategic importance. With America at war, the Navy's resistance to Higgins's designs finally collapsed under the weight of necessity. Orders poured in, not just for what would become known as the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, LCVP, but for larger craft capable of delivering tanks and heavy equipment. Higgins Industries, which had employed just 75 people before the war, began a dramatic expansion to meet this sudden demand. The transformation of Higgins Industries from a small regional boat builder to a major defense contractor, was remarkable in both speed and scale. Within months, Higgins had acquired additional facilities throughout New Orleans, converting existing buildings and constructing new ones to serve as production centers. By mid-1942, the company operated 8 plants in the New Orleans area and employed over 20,000 workers, a workforce more than 250 times larger than its pre-war size. This expansion required Higgins to implement revolutionary production methods. Traditional boat building was a craft process, with skilled workers constructing vessels individually from start to finish. Such methods could never produce the thousands of landing craft now needed monthly. Instead, Higgins adapted assembly line techniques from the automotive industry, breaking boat construction into specialized tasks, performed by teams of workers focused on specific components. Under this system, hull sections, ramps, engine mounts, and other components were manufactured separately in dedicated areas, then brought together for final assembly. Workers specialized in specific tasks rather than building entire boats, dramatically increasing both speed and consistency of production. At the peak of wartime operations, a completed Higgins boat was rolling off the assembly line approximately once every hour, a pace of maritime construction previously thought impossible. Beyond its production techniques, what truly set Higgins Industries apart was its approach to workforce diversity. At a time when racial segregation was still legally enforced throughout the American South, Higgins integrated his factories, hiring workers based on ability rather than race. African Americans worked alongside whites throughout his plants, often in skilled positions and with equal pay, a revolutionary practice in 1940s Louisiana. Higgins extended this meritocratic approach to gender as well, employing thousands of women in roles traditionally reserved for men. When questioned about these policies, which violated local social norms and potentially legal restrictions, Higgins was characteristically blunt. "I don't care if they're black, white, or purple. I only care if they can do the job." This pragmatic approach wasn't just morally progressive, it was industrially necessary. By drawing from the entire available labor pool rather than just white males, Higgins accessed talent and capacity that his competitors ignored. The diversity of his workforce became a crucial competitive advantage, allowing his company to scale production beyond what would otherwise have been possible. The vessels that emerged from these revolutionary production processes were equally unorthodox. Unlike the Navy's elegant but impractical designs, Higgins boats were utilitarian, almost crude in appearance. They featured a boxy hull with a flat bottom, a protected propeller in a semi-tunnel at the stern, and the all-important drop-down ramp at the bow. Measuring 36 feet in length and just under 11 feet in beam, they could carry 36 fully equipped troops, a jeep with a dozen men, or up to 8,100 pounds of cargo. Most revolutionary was the boat's operational performance. They could navigate effectively in just 3 feet of water, allowing them to approach much closer to beaches than conventional vessels. Their flat bottoms allowed them to be run directly onto shorelines without damage, while their powerful engines could quickly extract them from beaches, a crucial capability, allowing the boats to deliver their cargo and immediately return for more. The bow ramp allowed troops and vehicles to disembark directly onto dry land, rather than wading through water under enemy fire, significantly reducing casualties during the vulnerable landing phase. The primary construction material, another Higgins innovation, was plywood rather than traditional solid planking for many components. This decision, born of necessity as hardwood supplies dwindled under wartime demand, raised eyebrows among naval architects who considered plywood inferior for military vessels. But Higgins recognized that plywood's laminated construction actually provided excellent strength-to-weight ratios and could be mass-produced in standardized sheets. By developing new waterproofing techniques and structural reinforcements, he transformed this supposedly inferior material into a military asset that was lighter, faster to produce, and in many ways more durable than traditional construction. Navy officials remained skeptical until early trials in 1941 demonstrated the Higgins boat's clear superiority. In competitive tests against the Navy's own designs, Higgins's vessels consistently outperformed in the metrics that mattered most: shallow water operation, beaching capability, and troop delivery speed. Even then, some naval officers resisted, preferring their own designs despite their obvious flaws. It took direct intervention from President Roosevelt, after witnessing demonstration trials, to override the naval bureaucracy and approve mass production of Higgins boats. Meanwhile, Higgins continued to innovate beyond the basic LCVP design. When the military requested larger craft capable of delivering tanks and heavy vehicles directly to beaches, Higgins and his team developed the landing craft, mechanized LCM, essentially a scaled-up version of the LCVP capable of carrying a 30-ton tank or comparable cargo. When asked how quickly he could develop a prototype, Higgins famously replied, 3 days, a timeline the Navy deemed impossible. True to his word, Higgins's team produced a functional LCM prototype in just 61 hours, working around the clock to meet the self-imposed deadline. This ability to rapidly develop and iterate designs became a hallmark of Higgins Industries. When the Navy needed specialized craft for retrieving downed airmen, Higgins created the personnel rescue boat. When asked for high-speed vessels for coastal patrol, his team developed variants of the Patrol Torpedo PT boat. Each design incorporated the practical, field-tested innovations that defined Higgins's approach to naval architecture, often solving problems that had stumped conventional naval engineers. As America entered World War II in December 1941, the strategic implications of Higgins's innovations became increasingly clear. Traditional naval doctrine held that amphibious landings required established ports, strategic targets that would inevitably be heavily defended. The Higgins boat changed this equation entirely. Suddenly, Allied forces could land anywhere with a suitable beach, multiplying potential landing sites and forcing Axis powers to defend entire coastlines rather than specific harbors. This strategic advantage would prove decisive in both the European and Pacific theaters. The first major test of Higgins boats in combat came during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. Over 300 LCVPs delivered American and British troops to beaches in Morocco and Algeria, proving the concept in actual combat conditions. While the landings faced relatively light opposition compared to later operations, they provided valuable lessons that would be applied to future amphibious assaults. Most importantly, they demonstrated that large-scale landings directly onto beaches were not just possible, but could be executed with remarkable efficiency using Higgins's vessels. 8 months later, in July 1943, Higgins boats played a crucial role in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The operation involved over 2,000 landing craft, the majority of them Higgins designs, delivering 160,000 troops to beaches along a 100-mile stretch of coastline. The ability to land at multiple points simultaneously confused Axis defenders and prevented them from concentrating their forces at any single location. This principle, dispersed landings overwhelming defense capabilities, would become central to Allied amphibious doctrine throughout the remainder of the war. In the Pacific theater, Higgins boats proved equally valuable, but faced different challenges. Coral reefs surrounding many Japanese-held islands created natural barriers that could tear the bottom out of landing craft. Higgins responded by reinforcing the hulls of boats destined for Pacific service and developing tactics for negotiating reef passages. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines used Higgins boats to approach the reef, then waited the final distance when the boats could go no further. Though costly in lives, the lessons learned at Tarawa led to further refinements in both boat design and landing tactics for subsequent Pacific operations. Meanwhile, Higgins continued to refine his production techniques to meet escalating demand. By early 1944, His 8 plants in New Orleans employed over 20,000 workers operating in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Production had been streamlined to the point that a basic LCVP could be assembled in just 8 hours. In total, Higgins Industries would produce more than 23,000 landing craft during the war, vessels that would deliver troops to beaches from Normandy to Iwo Jima, from Sicily to Okinawa. The pinnacle of the Higgins boat's contribution to Allied victory came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious operation in history, Operation Overlord, involved landing 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. The operation employed more than 4,000 landing craft, the vast majority of them Higgins designs. Without these vessels, the entire operation would have been logistically impossible at the scale executed. The strategic genius of using Higgins boats for the Normandy landings extended beyond their practical utility for delivering troops. Traditional military doctrine would have directed Allied planners to capture a major port, Calais or Le Havre, to establish a secure supply line. However, the Germans had anticipated this approach and heavily fortified these obvious targets. The availability of Higgins boats completely changed the strategic calculus. Instead of being limited to ports, Allied forces could land on the long stretches of beach in Normandy, despite their distance from major harbors. This decision, enabled by Higgins's innovations, caught the German High Command by surprise and proved decisive in establishing the beachhead that would ultimately lead to victory in Europe. The landings themselves were harrowing, particularly at Omaha Beach, where German defenses remained largely intact despite pre-invasion bombing. As Higgins boats approached the shoreline, they faced a gauntlet of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. Many were hit before reaching the beach. Others successfully delivered their human cargo only to be destroyed on their return journey to the transport ships. Yet the sheer number of landing craft, combined with the courage of the men they carried, eventually overwhelmed the defenders. By nightfall, all 5 landing beaches were secure, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. In the aftermath of D-Day, the strategic genius of Higgins's contribution became even clearer. The Allies had established a beachhead without capturing a major port, something German military planners had considered impossible. In the weeks that followed, Higgins boats continued to ferry supplies and reinforcements to the Normandy beaches, sustaining the Allied advance inland. The boat's simple, robust design proved ideal for this punishing schedule, with damaged vessels quickly repaired and returned to service. Even when a massive storm damaged or destroyed nearly 100 landing craft on June 19th, the operation continued without significant interruption. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Higgins boats continued to play a crucial role in the island-hopping campaign against Japan. From Saipan to Guam, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, these versatile craft delivered Marines and Army troops to hostile shores across thousands of miles of ocean. Each operation presented unique challenges, from coral reefs to steep beaches to varying levels of enemy resistance. The basic Higgins design proved adaptable to all these conditions, with minor modifications addressing specific operational requirements. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Higgins boat's success was its impact on enemy planning. Both German and Japanese commanders were forced to completely reconsider their defensive strategies in light of Allied amphibious capabilities. No longer could they concentrate defenses around harbors and ports. Instead, they needed to defend entire coastlines, an impossible task given their limited resources. This strategic dilemma, created directly by Higgins' innovation, fundamentally undermined Axis defensive capabilities and contributed significantly to Allied victory. Throughout this period of unprecedented production and operational success, Higgins himself remained a controversial figure. Known for his colorful language, heavy drinking, and willingness to bypass official channels when necessary to get results, he frequently clashed with military bureaucrats and government officials. "Higgins is the kind of man you can only handle with a wild animal trainer's whip and chair," one Navy official complained. Yet his results were undeniable, and his dedication to the war effort was absolute. Despite his confrontational approach to authority figures, Higgins commanded extraordinary loyalty from his workers. He paid above-market wages, provided excellent working conditions by the standards of the time, and maintained a strict meritocratic approach to promotion and recognition. When material shortages threatened production schedules, Higgins would personally intervene, sometimes using unorthodox methods to secure needed supplies. His workforce responded with exceptional productivity, regularly exceeding quotas and setting new production records. Higgins' contribution extended beyond boat production. His integrated workforce proved that racial cooperation could work effectively in industrial settings, challenging prevailing segregationist attitudes in the American South. His production techniques revolutionized the boat-building industry, transforming it from a craft process to a modern industrial operation. His design innovations influenced naval architecture far beyond landing craft, establishing new approaches to shallow water operations that would impact vessel design for decades to come. As the war progressed, Higgins' vision extended to post-war applications of his manufacturing capacity. He began planning for conversion to civilian production, anticipating the eventual reduction in military contracts. His ambitious plans included mass-produced personal watercraft, prefabricated housing components, and even small aircraft, all leveraging the production techniques and workforce skills developed during wartime boat manufacturing. The man behind these vessels, Andrew Higgins, remained a controversial figure throughout the war. His battles with Navy bureaucrats continued even as his boats proved their worth in combat. He was known for his colorful language, heavy drinking, and willingness to bypass official channels when necessary to get results. "Higgins is the kind of man you can only handle with a wild animal trainer's whip and chair," one Navy official complained. Yet his results were undeniable. As one Marine officer put it, "If Higgins had been a Japanese, we'd never have landed on Guadalcanal." Higgins' contribution was recognized by many military leaders, none more prominently than General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Years after the war, when asked about the equipment that had proven most crucial to Allied victory, Eisenhower did not name a tank, aircraft, or artillery piece. Instead, he identified Higgins and his boats. "He is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." This assessment was not mere hyperbole. Without Higgins' boats, Allied forces would have been limited to assaulting established ports, predictable targets that could be heavily defended. The entire strategic approach to both the European and Pacific campaigns would have required fundamental reconsideration, potentially delaying victory by months or even years, with incalculable additional casualties. Higgins's innovation quite literally changed the course of the war. Yet, despite this crucial contribution, Higgins and his boats received relatively little public recognition during the war itself. While aircraft manufacturers proudly promoted their fighters and bombers, tank builders publicized their armored vehicles, and shipyards celebrated their destroyers and aircraft carriers, landing craft remained largely anonymous workhorses of the Allied war effort. Their unglamorous appearance and utilitarian function didn't capture public imagination the way more dramatic weapon systems did. This relative obscurity extended to Higgins himself. Though respected within military circles, he never achieved the public prominence of industrialists like Henry Kaiser, whose Liberty ships received extensive media coverage, or Henry Ford, whose mass production of aircraft made headlines. Higgins' contribution, though arguably more strategically significant than either, remained underappreciated by the general public both during and after the war. For the men who rowed Higgins' boats into combat, however, the vessel's value was never in question. Veterans of amphibious landings from North Africa to Normandy, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, remembered these craft as their critical link between ship and shore, the final vessel carrying them into battle. Many credited the boat's design with saving their lives, allowing them to reach beaches quickly and with minimal exposure to enemy fire compared to earlier landing methods. Lieutenant William Richards did not think about any of this as he directed his coxswain to maneuver their Higgins boat back through the chaos of Omaha Beach that June morning in 1944. His mind was on the immediate, delivering another load of troops, avoiding German fire, keeping his crew alive. Like thousands of other sailors operating landing craft that day, he had no time to consider the strategic implications of the vessel beneath his feet or the remarkable story of its creation. He knew only that it worked, that it could deliver men directly to the beach, reverse quickly, and return for more. In the crucible of combat, that functionality was all that mattered. As the war in Europe progressed toward Allied victory, Higgins began planning for the inevitable post-war transition. He anticipated that military contracts would decline sharply once hostilities ended and sought to diversify his company's activities. Drawing on the manufacturing capacity and skilled workforce developed during the war years, he explored civilian applications for his production techniques, including prefabricated housing, commercial vessels, and even small aircraft. These ambitious plans reflected Higgins's characteristic optimism and entrepreneurial spirit. However, they would soon face significant challenges. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, military contracts immediately began to decrease. The subsequent surrender of Japan in August 1945 accelerated this decline, with government orders for landing craft canceled virtually overnight. Higgins Industries, which had expanded dramatically to meet wartime demand, suddenly found itself with excess capacity and dwindling revenue. The immediate post-war years proved difficult for Higgins and his company. The rapid demobilization of the American military reduced demand for landing craft to a fraction of wartime levels. Attempts to convert production facilities to civilian goods faced numerous obstacles, including material shortages, changing market conditions, and intensifying labor disputes. By 1946, the company that had once employed over 20,000 workers had shrunk to a small fraction of that size. Labor relations, which had remained relatively harmonious during the high-pressure environment of wartime production, deteriorated as post-war economic realities forced difficult decisions about workforce reductions and compensation. Higgins, accustomed to the emergency powers and unified national purpose of wartime, struggled to navigate these new challenges. His confrontational management style, effective during crisis conditions, proved less successful in the complex economic and social environment of post-war America. Despite these difficulties, Higgins maintained his innovative approach to business challenges. He continued developing new vessel designs, including commercial adaptations of his military craft. He explored opportunities in emerging industries, including early fiberglass boat construction. He even ventured into aircraft design, though with limited commercial success. However, the massive infrastructure he had built for wartime production proved difficult to sustain in peacetime. In his personal life, the post-war period brought both recognition and health challenges. Various organizations honored his wartime contributions, including awards from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. However, the stress of managing his company's difficult transition took a toll on his health. Increasingly, day-to-day operations fell to his sons and other executives as Higgins battled various ailments. Andrew Jackson Higgins passed away on August 1, 1952, at the age of 65. His company, though much reduced from its wartime peak, continued operating under family management for several more years before eventually closing its doors. The massive industrial complex that had produced thousands of landing craft during the war was gradually repurposed or demolished, with few physical reminders remaining of its historic significance. In the years that followed, as the war receded into history, the story of the Higgins boat and its creator gradually faded from public consciousness. Hollywood war films tended to focus on the dramatic moments after troops landed on beaches rather than how they got there. Military historians examined the grand strategy of amphibious operations without always acknowledging the technological innovations that made them possible. For decades, Andrew Higgins remained largely forgotten, except by those who had ridden his boats into combat. But the significance of Higgins's contribution could not be permanently obscured. In the 1990s, a renewed interest in World War II brought fresh attention to the logistical and technological factors that had shaped Allied victory. Historians began to recognize that Higgins' boats had fundamentally altered the nature of amphibious warfare, transforming it from a specialized operation requiring specific geographical conditions to a flexible tactic applicable to virtually any coastline. This recognition culminated in the founding of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2000, a location chosen specifically to honor the city's role as the birthplace of the vessels that had made Allied victory possible. Today, very few original Higgins boats survive, perhaps fewer than 20 out of the more than 23,000 produced. Most were scrapped after the war or modified beyond recognition for civilian use. Those that remain are preserved in museums or private collections as rare artifacts of one of history's most consequential conflicts. Their scarcity stands in ironic contrast to their once ubiquitous presence on beaches around the world, where they delivered the Allied forces that ultimately secured victory in World War II. The design principles Higgins pioneered continue to influence modern landing craft. Contemporary amphibious vessels still incorporate many features first implemented in the LCVP, bow ramps, protected propulsion systems, shallow drafts, and rugged construction. While materials and propulsion technologies have evolved, the basic functional requirements remain remarkably similar to those Higgins identified and solved more than 80 years ago. Beyond specific design elements, Higgins's approach to innovation offers enduring lessons. His willingness to challenge established orthodoxy, to draw inspiration from diverse sources, including potential enemies, and to prioritize practical functionality over theoretical elegance, all remain relevant to modern engineering challenges. His integration of design, testing, and production into a unified process, rather than treating them as separate sequential activities, anticipated modern approaches to product development by decades. The story of Andrew Jackson Higgins offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. It demonstrates how innovation often comes from outside established institutions, from practical problem solvers rather than theoretical experts. Higgins succeeded not because he understood naval architecture better than Navy engineers, but because he approached the problem from a completely different perspective, that of a civilian boat builder familiar with the challenges of shallow water operations. His willingness to incorporate ideas from diverse sources, including the Japanese ramp design observed by Major Krulak, reflected an intellectual flexibility often lacking in military procurement systems. Higgins also understood something that military planners sometimes overlooked, that in warfare, simplicity and reliability often trump sophistication. His boats were not technologically advanced by the standards of their time. They featured no revolutionary propulsion systems, no cutting-edge materials, no complex mechanisms. What made them revolutionary was their appropriateness to the task at hand, their ability to solve the specific problem of delivering troops directly onto beaches quickly and efficiently. This principle, that the best military technology is not necessarily the most advanced, but the most suitable for its intended purpose, remains relevant today. Perhaps most importantly, Higgins demonstrated the crucial role of industrial capacity and production efficiency in modern warfare. His boats succeeded not just because they were well designed, but because they could be mass-produced quickly enough to meet the enormous demands of global war. By applying assembly line techniques to boat building, Higgins transformed what had traditionally been a craft process into an industrial one. This transformation, multiplied across America's industrial base, created what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy that ultimately overwhelmed Axis production capabilities. Higgins' approach to workforce integration also offers important historical lessons. At a time when racial segregation was legally enforced throughout the American South, Higgins's decision to hire and promote workers based on ability rather than race represented a significant challenge to prevailing social norms. This was not merely a moral stance, it was a practical business decision that gave his company access to talent and capacity unavailable to competitors who maintained segregated workforces. The success of Higgins's integrated plants demonstrated that prejudice was not just morally wrong, but economically inefficient, a powerful argument against discrimination that complemented ethical objections. The workforce integration at Higgins Industries also provided valuable experience for thousands of workers who had previously been excluded from skilled industrial positions. African Americans and women who gained technical expertise and supervisory experience at Higgins plants during the war carried these skills into the post-war economy, contributing to gradual changes in employment patterns throughout American industry. Though full workplace equality remained distant, the wartime experience at companies like Higgins Industries helped demonstrate its possibility. Higgins himself represented a distinctly American archetype, the self-made entrepreneur whose practical ingenuity and determination allowed him to succeed despite limited formal education. Born in landlocked Nebraska, with no family connections to maritime industries, he nonetheless revolutionized naval warfare through sheer force of will and inventive problem-solving. His story embodies the American ideal of meritocracy, where talent and hard work can overcome background limitations. Yet Higgins's story also reveals the limitations of individual achievement. Despite his undeniable contribution to Allied victory, his business faced significant challenges once the unifying national purpose of wartime production ended. The post-war economic environment, with its complex labor relations, fluctuating markets, and reduced government support, proved more difficult to navigate than the all-out production demands of global war. Even a man of Higgins' remarkable talents couldn't fully overcome these structural challenges. In the end, the legacy of Andrew Jackson Higgins and his boats transcends their specific contribution to Allied victory in World War II. They represent the American capacity for practical innovation, for seeing beyond established doctrine to discover new solutions to pressing problems. They remind us that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are also the simplest, and that the perspective of outsiders often provides insights unavailable to established experts. Above all, they demonstrate that in war as in peace, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom can sometimes change the course of history. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure. Despite fierce resistance and heavy casualties, particularly at Omaha Beach, Allied forces had established a foothold in Nazi-occupied France. The great gamble had paid off, and floating offshore, battered but still functional, were hundreds of Higgins boats, unglamorous vessels that had made the entire operation possible. They would return the next day and the day after that, ferrying men and supplies to shore until proper port facilities could be established. Their simple wooden hulls and drop-down ramps would never capture the public imagination like fighter planes or tanks, but in their practical, unassuming way, they had altered the course of the war and perhaps of history itself. In those same waters, with German shells still occasionally splashing nearby, Lieutenant William Richards patted the gunwale of his vessel as he prepared for another crossing. "Not much to look at," he told a fellow officer, "but she gets the job done." It was perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Higgins boat, a humble craft that changed the world not through technological sophistication, but through practical effectiveness. In war, as Andrew Higgins had always understood, results matter more than appearance or pedigree, and by that measure, his boats had already earned their place in history. In New Orleans, as news of the successful landings spread, workers at Higgins Industries celebrated briefly before returning to their tasks. There were still battles to be fought, more landings to support, more boats to build. The war was far from over. But Andrew Higgins allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The naval bureaucrats who had dismissed his designs, the traditionalists who had insisted his methods wouldn't work, the skeptics who had questioned his unorthodox approach, all had been proven wrong in the crucible of combat. His boats had delivered the Allied forces to Hitler's fortress Europe, just as he had promised they would. Years later, military historians would debate the factors that led to Allied victory in World War II. They would point to industrial production, technological innovation, strategic leadership, and the courage of individual soldiers. All played their part. But for those who landed on beaches from North Africa to Normandy, from Sicily to Saipan, one factor stood out: the humble Higgins boat that had carried them into battle. As one D-Day veteran put it, "Without those boats, we'd still be in England, figuring out how to get across." The question remains, would you have had the courage to defy military orthodoxy, as Andrew Higgins did? Would you have persisted in the face of institutional resistance, trusting your practical experience over theoretical expertise? Would you have risked your business and reputation on the conviction that your approach was right, even when powerful authorities insisted it was wrong? These are not just historical questions, but challenges that confront innovators in every field and every era. The story of the Higgins boat reminds us that sometimes the most patriotic act is not blind obedience to authority, but the willingness to challenge it when necessary, especially when lives are at stake. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the physical courage of those who landed on distant beaches, but the moral courage of those who made it possible by daring to think differently.